Here's how you can quickly clean up your podcast audio in just a couple of minutes with a few plugins. First, let's listen to this raw track.
So it started with me.
So right off the bat, I hear that there's a lot of noise, there's a good amount of reverb, and it's recorded with what sounds like it's probably a laptop mic. So the first thing we'll do is do some noise and reverb reduction. For this, I start with dxRevive Pro. It defaults to the natural 2 setting for me, but I know with audio like this, I'm probably going to want something a little more aggressive, but let's try it out.
So it started with me.
Let's try Studio 3.
So it started with me. I was very...
Okay, I think that sounds better, so we'll leave that there for now. But let's try to make it a little bit better with some EQ. For that, I'll bring up the Sonible Smart EQ, which uses machine learning to suggest a good EQ curve. The first step we take is to tell it what type of audio we're working with. In this case, it's speech, and it's a high-pitched voice, so we'll go speech high. Now we hit the train button. It looks kind of like a green record button. And then we play some audio through it.
So it started with me. I was very, well, I would say high needs baby. You know, if my mom tells everybody.
So first thing I want to do is adjust this bar so that we're only treating anything above 100 hertz. Then I'll apply a high-pass filter or a low-cut filter, depending on what kind of terminology you use. I'll set the curve to negative 6 dB and adjust it to about 65 hertz. That way we're cutting off the low end that would otherwise just be kind of boomy for anybody listening in a car. So now let's listen back to it with the EQ.
So it started with me. I was very, well, I would say high needs baby. You know, if my mom tells everybody my story,
So that's sounding better, but let's try to address the dynamics. The way her speaking is, it kind of goes high and then low, or loud and quiet, rather. So let's bring in some compression. Again, another Sonible Smart plugin. This time it's the Smart Comp 2. It's the same process. Tell it what type of audio we're working with. We'll train it. I usually want to look for a place that has pretty high dynamic range. So we go from quiet here to a little bit louder, quiet, and then we've got the laugh. So this is a good place to train it.
My mom tells everybody my story. Absolutely.
And the last step in the compressor is to turn on input writing, which essentially tells the plugin to try to keep the input signal at a relatively constant level. That way it's not having to compress quite as heavily. So you turn that on by clicking on it. Now let's listen back to it and listen to how much more steady or consistent the volume is on her dialogue.
So it started with me. I was very, well, I would say high needs baby. You know, if my mom tells everybody my story,
It still retains a lot of those natural dynamics, but it's a little more steady in volume. The one thing that I notice is by compressing it, we've brought up the noise on the track again. So for that, I'll use iZotope RX voice denoise. This is my default starting point. Let's dial it in.
So it started with me. I was very, well, I would say high needs baby. You know, if my my mom tells everybody my story. I
So I reduced the reduction from 15 dB to 8. The reason is we want to use only as much as we need with the plugin like this, because higher settings will do more damage. But let's listen back to this to hear how much better it sounds.
So it started with me. I was very
So let's start with everything bypassed so we can hear where we started, and then I'll turn everything back on to hear how much of a difference we've made.
So it started with me. I was a very, I would say, high needs baby. If my mom tells everybody my story.
It's not perfect because we're starting off with a very imperfect recording. We could probably spend a little extra time trying to remove some of the resonance in here, but in my mind, it really isn't worth it because we're only going to make it sound maybe 5% better. It's not going to have a big enough impact to justify the time spent trying to make it better. To me, this is a much more listenable track than what we started with, and that's what we're trying to deliver. So if you enjoyed this video, check out my channel where I have a lot more videos about how to create better sounding audio.